At 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, the frozen silence of the Ardennes forest exploded with German artillery fire. The shells came screaming out of the darkness. Hundreds of them, thousands, ripping apart the frozen earth and shattering trees that had stood for a century. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous thundering roar that shook the ground and rattled teeth and skulls across an 85 meters front. American soldiers crouched in foxholes near the Belgian town of Malmedy, watching the pre-dawn darkness turn to fire. Most were young men in their early 20s, quartermaster clerks and supply specialists, infantrymen recovering from the brutal Hürtgen forest, campaign and green replacements getting their first taste of the European theater. They knew precisely how many gallons of gasoline moved through First Army depots each day. Approximately 1.4 million gallons during offensive operations. They knew which units needed fuel and which roads the supply trucks traveled. What they did not know was how to fight off German tanks. The men huddled in their positions, had no inkling that they were about to become participants in the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would fight in the entire Second World War. They had been told repeatedly that the Ardennes sector was safe, that the dense forests and narrow roads made it unsuitable for major armored operations. The snow-covered landscape before them, beautiful in its winter stillness just moments before, now erupted with fire and death. For thousands of American soldiers across the front, these would be their final moments on Earth. Nobody in the Ardennes was supposed to be in combat. The generals had called this sector a quiet zone, a rest area for exhausted divisions and inexperienced replacements. The intelligence officers assured everyone that the Germans lacked the strength for any major offensive. The Wehrmacht was finished, they said. The Reich was crumbling. The war would be over by Christmas. The artillery barrage lasted 90 minutes. When it stopped, the American soldiers heard something that froze their blood. Engine noise. Not American engines, not the familiar rumble of Sherman tanks or the whine of Jeep motors. Something heavier, deeper, more ominous. The grinding roar of tracked vehicles pushing through the forest. Panzers. The Germans were attacking with tanks. What nobody on the Allied side yet understood was that Adolf Hitler had assembled the largest German offensive force since the invasion of France in 1940, 28 divisions. Nearly 200,000 soldiers. Almost 1,000 tanks and assault guns had been gathered in secret along the German frontier. They had moved into position during the nights, hiding from Allied reconnaissance aircraft under the cover of forest and low clouds. German radio discipline had been perfect. Almost no signals intelligence had leaked to Allied Coderakers. Their objective was the port city of Antwerp, 125 miles to the northwest. Antwerp handled more tonnage than any other port supplying the Allied armies. If the Germans could seize it, they would split the British and American forces in two, and potentially force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was a desperate gamble, but Hitler believed that one bold stroke could still turn the war in Germany's favor. The offensive was sent amid Wed Amrin, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive-sounding name designed to mislead any Allied intelligence that might intercept it. The Americans would eventually call it the Battle of the Bulge, named for the salient the Germans created in Allied lines. And the spearhead of this massive assault, the tip of the German lance, aimed at the heart of Allied logistics, was a single battle group built around the most feared tanks in the German arsenal. What happened over the next 48 hours would come down to a resource that both sides desperately needed. Not men, not ammunition, not willpower, but fuel. Gasoline, the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare. The Germans had calculated that they needed approximately 5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. They started the offensive with less than half that amount. Everything depended on capturing American supply depots along the way. They would come within 4 miles of their objective, 4 miles from the bridges over the Meuse River, 4 miles from potential victory. And they would stop, not because of American firepower or Allied reinforcements, but because their tanks ran completely dry. The greatest German offensive of 1944 would end with the quiet clicking of fuel gauges on empty. The commander of the German spearhead was a 29-year-old lieutenant colonel named Joachim Peiper, even among the hardened veterans of the Waffen-SS. Men who had fought across Russia and Ukraine in some of the most brutal combat of the war. Piper had a reputation for ruthlessness and aggression. He was tall, blonde, with the chiseled features that Nazi propaganda celebrated as the Aryan ideal. He was utterly devoted to the Nazi cause, and completely indifferent to the suffering of anyone outside his command. Piper had joined the Waffen-SS at age 19 and risen rapidly through the ranks. By 1941, he was commanding armored units on the Eastern Front, leading attacks against Soviet positions with a ferocity that earned him medals and promotions. His men called him Blowtorch Piper for his willingness to burn villages suspected of harboring partisans. Soviet soldiers learned to fear his unit. So did civilians caught in his path. Now, in December 1944, Piper commanded Kampfgruppe Piper, a reinforced battle group drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Hitler's personal bodyguard division transformed into an elite armored formation. On paper, his force was formidable. Approximately 4,800 men, 117 tanks of various types, and hundreds of half-tracks, artillery pieces, and support vehicles. His column, when fully extended on the road, stretched for nearly 15 miles. Among his tanks were roughly 30 Tiger, 2 heavy tanks assigned from the 5,001st Heavy SS Panzer Battalion. The Tiger II was the most powerful armored vehicle in the world. It weighed nearly 70 tons, more than twice the weight of an American Sherman. Its frontal armor was 180 millimeters thick, impervious to any tank gun the Americans possessed. Its main weapon was an 88 millimeters cannon that could destroy a Sherman from over 2 miles away. American tankers called it the King Tiger, and they feared it above all other German weapons. Many would not even engage a Tiger II directly, preferring to call in airstrikes or artillery rather than face that massive cannon. But the Tiger II had a fatal weakness that Piper understood better than anyone. A weakness that would ultimately doom his entire offensive. It consumed fuel at a catastrophic rate. The massive Maybach HL230P30 engine, the same engine used in the much lighter Panther tank, was hopelessly inadequate for moving 70 tons of steel. The engine gulped approximately 2 gallons of gasoline for every mile traveled on good roads. Off-road through the muddy, cratered, forested terrain of the Ardennes, consumption could double or triple. On steep grades, a Tiger II might burn a gallon of fuel just to advance a few hundred yards. A single Tiger II needed 860 L of fuel just to fill its 7 internal tanks. At full combat consumption, it could drain those tanks in less than 2 hours. The tank's operational range was theoretically 110 kilometers on roads, but in actual combat conditions it was often far less. German quartermasters joked grimly that the Tiger II was a magnificent weapon, provided you never had to move it. Piper had done the mathematics before the offensive began. His battle group would need to capture American fuel supplies within the first 2 days, or the attack would stall completely. There was simply no way German logistics could deliver enough fuel through the narrow, contested roads of the Ardennes to sustain his advance. German logistics officers had assured him that major American fuel depots lay along his route of advance. Intelligence indicated massive stockpiles near the towns of Bollingen and Stavalet. Capture those supplies and his panzers could reach the Meuse and beyond. Miss them and the offensive would die on the frozen roads of Belgium. The night before the attack, Piper received his final briefing at his command post near Blankenheim, Germany. The plan was aggressive, perhaps recklessly so. His battle group would punch through the thinly held American lines near the Loheim Gap, a natural corridor through the hilly terrain. Then he would race westward at maximum speed, exploiting gaps in the American defenses before they could react. No stopping for prisoners, no consolidating gains, no waiting for infantry support. Speed was everything. Piper was told to drive for the Meuse as if the devil himself were chasing him. But even as Piper prepared his tanks, problems were emerging. The roads assigned to his advance were narrow and poorly maintained, more suitable for farm carts than 70-ton tanks. Some were little more than logging tracks through dense forest. His heavy Tiger II tanks would struggle on these routes, and if one broke down or became stuck, it would block the entire column. Traffic jams seemed inevitable. More concerning was the fuel situation. German quartermaster units had been unable to position sufficient fuel supplies forward due to Allied air attacks that made daytime movement suicidal. Even moving at night, supply convoys had been decimated by Allied fighter bombers prowling the roads. Piper would begin the offensive with his tanks, carrying only enough fuel for approximately 90 to 100 meters of travel. The Meuse River crossings at Huy were over 120 miles from his starting point. There was no margin for error. Every delay, every detour, every minute of idling would consume irreplaceable fuel. At 0530 hours on December 16th, the German artillery opened fire along an 85 meters front. 1,600 artillery pieces fired simultaneously, creating a wall of destruction that American survivors would compare to the greatest bombardments of the First World War. The shells fell among American positions for 90 minutes, destroying communications wires, collapsing bunkers, and stunning the defenders. The Americans had no warning. Most of the units in the Ardennes were either exhausted veterans sent to rest after the meat, grinder of the Hurricane Forest, or inexperienced divisions getting their first taste of the front. The 99th Infantry Division had been in combat for only a few weeks. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived in theater less than 2 weeks earlier and had never fired a shot in anger. The 28th Infantry Division had been nearly destroyed in the Hurricane and was rebuilding in what was supposed to be a quiet sector. When the German infantry emerged from the forests, many American units simply collapsed. Some surrendered, some fled, some vanished entirely. Their soldiers killed, captured, or scattered across the snowy landscape. The German shells fell among them like hammer blows, and the attacking infantry swept over their shattered positions. But not all American units broke. Across the front, small groups of soldiers, sometimes just a handful of men, chose to stand and fight. A single American platoon at Lanzarote, just 18 men from the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, held off an entire German parachute battalion of over 500 soldiers for nearly a day, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. Their commander, Lieutenant Lyle Boo, just 20 years old at the time, would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for that defense. Similar desperate stands occurred all along the front, small units buying time with their lives. Piper waited impatiently as the infantry and Volksgrenadier divisions began their assault. His tanks were supposed to exploit breakthroughs created by the foot soldiers, but the infantry was struggling. The narrow roads through the forest could not accommodate both attacking infantry and the tanks trying to move forward behind them. Traffic jams developed almost immediately. A railroad overpass that was supposed to support his heavy tanks turned out to be too weak, sagging dangerously when the first Tiger II attempted to cross. Engineers needed hours to reinforce it. Hours that Piper did not have. The delays mounted. By noon on December 16th, Piper was already hours behind the timetable that called for him to reach the Meuse crossings by the evening of December 17th. His laid tanks could not move forward because the roads were clogged with infantry, horse-drawn artillery, and supply vehicles. German traffic control had broken down completely in the chaos of the offensive. Meanwhile, fuel was burning. Every hour his engines idled was another few gallons gone forever. It was not until nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon that Piper finally got his armored column moving. By then, 16 precious hours had been lost. The element of surprise was evaporating. American commanders were waking up to the scale of the German assault and rushing reinforcements toward the threatened sectors. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were already loading onto trucks for the drive to the Ardennes. Armored divisions were wheeling south from other sectors. The window of opportunity was closing. Piper pushed his column hard through the night, headlights blazing despite the risk of air attack. He knew that speed was his only chance. His lead vehicles reached the village of Lachem by 7:30 in the evening. From there, his route led westward through the Belgian villages of Lanzarote, Hornsfeld, and Bullingen. At Bullingen, his intelligence indicated there was an American fuel depot. It was a critical objective, the first chance to replenish his thirsty tanks. The column reached Lanzarote around 4:30 in the morning on December 17th, only to find that the village had not yet been secured. A handful of American soldiers had been holding the position against an entire German parachute regiment for nearly 24 hours. Piper was furious at the delay caused by this tiny force of defenders. He personally took charge, pushed the paratroopers forward, and got his panzers moving again toward Hansfeld. At Hansfeld, chaos reigned. American rest centers and supply units were caught completely by surprise. Soldiers stumbled out of warm billets in their underwear to find German tanks rolling down the main street. Piper's tanks drove through the village, machine guns chattering, capturing American soldiers and vehicles. But there was no time to process prisoners properly, no time to search buildings, no time to do anything but push forward. The lead elements pressed on while rear units dealt with the Americans they had overrun. Then, Piper received welcome news. His scouts reported an American fuel depot at Bollingen just a few miles to the south. It was not a large depot, perhaps 50,000 gallons, but it was fuel his thirsty Panzers desperately needed. The capture of that fuel could extend his range by precious miles. The capture of Bollingen on the morning of December 17th gave Piper's campaign a brief boost. His tanks, refueled from American supplies and captured American prisoners, were forced at gunpoint to help fill German fuel tanks. German tankers topped off their vehicles, while American soldiers' guns trained on them passed Jerry's hand to hand. But 50,000 gallons was not enough. It was barely a drop in the ocean of Piper's needs. His battle group consumed roughly 40,000 gallons just to advance 50 miles. He needed far more to sustain his drive to the Meuse. According to his intelligence, the major American fuel depots lay further west near Stavalet and Spa. Those depots reportedly held over 3 million gallons of gasoline, enough to fuel his entire division all the way to Antwerp. They became his primary objective, even more important than the bridges themselves. After refueling at Bollingen, Piper's column continued west. The road led through the crossroads at Bonn, about 2 miles south of the town of Malmedy. It was here shortly after noon on December 17th that one of the most infamous incidents of the war occurred. An atrocity that would horrify the world and seal Piper's reputation as a war criminal. Piper Spearhead encountered a convoy of American trucks and jeeps from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. These were not combat troops, but technicians and surveyors, men whose job was to spot artillery fire, not fight tanks. They were caught in the open, outgunned, and outnumbered. After a brief exchange of fire that killed a few Americans, approximately 150 soldiers surrendered. What happened next shocked the world. The American prisoners were assembled in a snowy field near the crossroads, searched and relieved of their personal possessions. Then, for reasons that remain debated to this day, SS soldiers opened fire on the unarmed men with machine guns. The shooting continued for several minutes. Methodical and merciless, SS troops walked among the fallen bodies, executing any who showed signs of life with pistol shots to the head. Survivors later recalled hearing laughter among the German soldiers as they killed the wounded. 84 American soldiers died in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. More than 40 survived, some by playing dead in the frozen field for hours until the Germans departed, others by fleeing into the nearby woods during the chaos of the shooting. Among the survivors were men like Private Harold Billow, Sergeant Henry Zack of Wisconsin, and Private Warren Schmidt, who would later provide crucial testimony about what they witnessed. Their accounts given under oath at the post-war trials painted a horrifying picture of systematic murder carried out against helpless prisoners. The survivors who made it back to American lines spread word of the atrocity immediately. Within hours, every American unit in the Ardennes knew what had happened at Bonds. The effect on American morale was profound, but not in the way the Germans intended. Rather than terrorizing American soldiers into surrender, the massacre hardened their resolve to a diamond edge. Word spread through American units. No mercy for the SS. Some commanders issued unofficial orders that SS prisoners were not to be taken. The killing at Malmedy would be repaid many times over in the days that followed. Piper himself was not present at the massacre, having already pushed forward with his lead tanks toward the bridges at Two Ponds, but the killing was carried out by soldiers under his command, and he would later be held responsible. The Malmedy massacre would haunt him for the rest of his life and shape his legacy forever. As the massacre unfolded at Bonds, Piper's lead elements continued their race toward the Meuse. By late afternoon on December 17th, his spearhead reached the outskirts of Stavalet, a small town straddling the Bulge River. The town itself was not particularly important, but what lay just north of it most certainly was. First Army Fuel Depot No. 3 contained over 1 million gallons of 80-octane gasoline. A larger depot nearby held an additional 2 million gallons. Together, These stocks represented one of the greatest concentrations of fuel on the entire European continent. 3 million gallons, enough to fuel Piper's entire battle group for the drive to Antwerp and back. If he captured them intact, his offensive would succeed. If the Americans destroyed or evacuated them, his panzers would die of thirst within days. The race for the fuel dumps had begun. The American officer responsible for denying Piper his fuel was not a combat commander but a civil engineer wearing the uniform of a combat engineer. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergren commanded the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, a unit of men trained to build bridges, clear minefields, and construct roads. They were not frontline infantry. They had not been trained for the kind of desperate fighting they were about to experience, but they understood one thing perfectly: how to destroy things. Perring was 27 years old, a graduate of Pennsylvania State University, who had worked in construction before the war. He had led his battalion through Normandy and the advance across France, building pontoon bridges and clearing obstacles for the advancing armies. His men had never faced enemy tanks directly. Now German armor was bearing down on them, and Perring had to improvise a defense with the tools and men available. When word of the German breakthrough reached Perring on December 17th, he immediately recognized the threat to the fuel depots near Stavelot. He dispatched squads of engineers to mine roads, prepare bridges for demolition, and establish roadblocks using anything available. Felled trees, disabled vehicles, minefields hastily laid across road junctions. Every hour of delay they could impose on Piper was an hour in which precious fuel could be evacuated or destroyed. At Thuan, a town named for its 3 bridges over the Umblève and Palm rivers, Perring's engineers worked frantically through the night of December 17th. They wired the bridges with TNT, strung detonation cord, and positioned soldiers to guard the explosives from German patrols. If Piper could cross these bridges, he could continue his drive toward the Meuse. If the bridges were destroyed, he would be forced to find alternative routes through terrain that was already consuming his dwindling fuel supplies at a catastrophic rate. The situation at Stavelot was desperate. The town was defended by a handful of American soldiers, mostly service troops with limited combat experience. They had rifles and a few machine guns, but nothing that could stop a 70 Tiger II tank. To their north lay the massive fuel dumps guarded by approximately 60 Belgian soldiers of the 5th Belgian Fusiliers. These Belgians were former resistance fighters recruited just months earlier when their country was liberated. They had courage and determination but little heavy equipment and no experience fighting armored vehicles. As darkness fell on December 17th, Piper's column approached Stavelot from the east. The German commander faced a critical decision. His tanks had been moving almost continuously for nearly 2 days. His men were exhausted, having had little sleep since the offensive began. His fuel situation was becoming critical, the gauges dropping toward empty on tank after tank. The prudent course would be to halt, consolidate, refuel what vehicles he could from captured stocks, and attack at dawn with full strength. Piper chose to halt for the night on the outskirts of Stavelot. He needed to rest his men and assess his fuel situation. It was a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. It would prove catastrophic. Those hours of darkness gave the Americans time to prepare defenses and most critically begin evacuating the precious fuel stocks to the north. Throughout the night of December 17th to 18th, American trucks rolled north from Stavelot, carrying thousands of jerry cans filled with gasoline. The evacuation was chaotic and incomplete, hampered by the narrow roads and the constant threat of German attack. But every gallon removed was a gallon Piper would not capture. Men worked by flashlight, loading cans onto trucks that had been commandeered from every unit in the area. Belgian civilians helped where they could, understanding that their fate was tied to the outcome of the battle. At dawn on December 18th, Piper launched his assault on Stavelot. His panzers rumbled toward the bridge over the Amble River, while American defenders fought desperately to slow the advance. The Americans had positioned an anti-tank gun covering the approach, but the first German tanks destroyed it quickly. SS infantry rushed forward under covering fire, pushing back the outnumbered Americans. By mid-morning, German tanks were rolling across the bridge into Stavelot itself. But as Piper's men secured the town, they discovered a bitter truth. The fuel depot they had expected to capture was not in Stavelot itself. The main dumps lay to the north along the road to Francoms, and that road was now threatened by American forces filtering in from other sectors. Major Paul Salas, acting commander of the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion, had positioned himself near the fuel depot with a small force of infantry and a single 57mm anti-tank gun. When German tanks began moving through Stavelot, Salas made a decision that would help doom Paper's offensive. Salas ordered his men and the Belgian guards to pour gasoline from the depot into a dip in the road and set it ablaze. The resulting wall of flame rose 30 feet high, creating an impossible barrier for any vehicle. Approximately 124,000 gallons of precious fuel burned in that improvised roadblock, sending a pillar of black smoke into the winter sky that could be seen for miles. But the fire did more than create an obstacle. It convinced Salas that the Germans would follow him northward to the fuel depot. In fact, Piper had no intelligence indicating the location of the dumps. German maps showed nothing at Francoon. Piper assumed the Americans had already evacuated or destroyed any supplies in the area. He pushed his column west toward Trappe and the bridges over the SM River, not north toward the millions of gallons that could have saved his offensive. What Piper did not know, what he would only learn in a post-war interrogation with an American intelligence officer, was that his tanks had come within a few hundred yards of 3 million gallons of gasoline. The depot was practically under his nose, hidden along forest roads just north of Stavelot. An American officer asked Piper after the war if he realized how close he had been to capturing enough fuel to reach Antwerp. Piper shrugged and replied simply, "I am sorry." He had not known the depot existed. The 3 million gallons that Piper missed continued to be evacuated throughout December 18th. By the time the situation stabilized, the Americans had removed most of the fuel to safety, trucking it north toward Spar and beyond. The improvised fire barrier had burned 124,000 gallons, a significant loss, but nothing compared to what the Germans would have gained by capturing the intact depot. Meanwhile, Piper's column pressed toward Thuin, where the engineers waited with their demolition charges. At approximately 11:30 on the morning of December 18th, the first German tanks appeared on the road from Stavelot. Approaching the bridge over the Amblève at Thuin, the engineers had prepared the bridge for demolition, rigging it with TNT and running detonation cord to a protected position. Captain Sam Scheiber of Company C, 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, commanded the small force defending the crossing. The engineers waited until the lead German tanks were almost upon them, allowing the Panzers to commit fully to the crossing. Then Scheiber gave the order. The engineers touched off the charges. The explosion sent debris raining down on Piper's tanks. The bridge collapsed into the river, cutting off the main route westward. The German commander watched in fury as his objective disappeared in a cloud of smoke and shattered timber. According to witnesses, he slammed his fist against his tank and shouted, "Those damned engineers! The damned engineers!" Piper ordered his column to turn north, seeking another crossing. At the village of Laz, his scouts reported a small bridge that might support his vehicles. But this route led away from the Meuse, not toward it. Every mile traveled was a mile of fuel consumed, bringing his offensive closer to its inevitable end. The pattern repeated throughout December 18th and 19th. Each time Piper found a route forward, American engineers destroyed the bridges in his path. At Haberment, a squad from the 291st Engineers blew the bridge over the Lean Creek while German vehicles were actually approaching. The explosion caught some Germans on the span itself. At shore, a small wooden bridge was destroyed just as German tanks reached the approaches. At every river crossing, every creek, every stream, the engineers waited with their explosives. By the evening of December 18th, Piper had advanced over 100 kilometers from his starting point, further than any other German unit in the offensive, but he was no closer to the Meuse than he had been that morning. The blown bridges had forced him to detour repeatedly, burning fuel on roads that led nowhere. His fuel situation was now desperate. The Tiger II tanks that had terrified American soldiers just days earlier sat immo by the roadside, their massive fuel tanks completely empty. Piper sent urgent radio messages to division headquarters requesting fuel resupply. The response was not encouraging. Other German units were also critically short. The narrow roads through the Ardennes were clogged with traffic. Allied fighter bombers, now operating as the weather began to clear, were destroying German supply vehicles by the dozens. Relief was coming, headquarters assured him, but it might take days to reach him, days that Piper did not have. On December 19th, Piper captured the town of Stoumont after fierce fighting against elements of the 30th Infantry Division. His tanks were within a few miles of Spa, where 1st Army headquarters was frantically evacuating its command post. American generals could hear German tank guns in the distance, but Piper lacked the fuel to exploit his gains. His lead vehicles were running on fumes, literally scraping the bottoms of their fuel tanks. That afternoon, Piper made a devastating assessment of his situation. He determined that his camp grouper did not have sufficient gasoline to cross the bridge west of Stoumont and continue the advance. His tanks could not move. The spearhead of Hitler's great offensive had ground to a halt, not from enemy action, but from empty fuel tanks. At the same time, American reinforcements were pouring into the Ardennes from every direction. The 82nd Airborne Division arrived at Toipon, blocking any further German movement to the west. The 30th Infantry Division established defensive positions around Stoumont and Gleize. Task forces from the 3rd Armored Division cut the roads behind Piper, threatening to surround his entire battle group. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Piper's situation deteriorated rapidly over the next 4 days. American forces recaptured Stavelot on December 19th, cutting his last supply route. His battle group was now completely surrounded, trapped in a pocket around the village of Legels. An attempted resupply by air on December 22nd failed catastrophically when SS Brigade Foro Wilhelm Mona, his divisional commander, insisted that the grid coordinates Piper had provided were wrong. The Luftwaffe pilots dropped their cargo containers using Monk's coordinates instead. 90% of the fuel and ammunition parachuted down fell outside German lines, landing among American positions. The soldiers of the 82nd Airborne were delighted to receive German supplies. German headquarters tried increasingly desperate measures to reach Piper. One plan involved floating fuel drums down the Meuse River to his position. The drums were launched upstream but became stuck or capsized in the rapids. Not a single gallon reached the besieged battle group. Another attempt to break through with a relief column from KF. Grouper Hansen was thrown back by determined American resistance at the river crossings. By December 22nd, Piper's camp group was completely encircled in the village of Legels. His men had not eaten properly in days, surviving on frozen rations and whatever they could scavenge from destroyed vehicles. They had virtually no ammunition for sustained combat, having expended most of their supplies in the desperate fighting of the past week. Most critically, they had no fuel whatsoever. The magnificent Tiger, 2 tanks that had been the terror of the Ardennes, sat in the village streets, immobilized and useless, their engines cold. American artillery pounded Les relentlessly around the clock. Shells fell every few minutes, reducing buildings to rubble and filling the air with deadly shrapnel. The village was being systematically destroyed around the German defenders. Approximately 50 Belgian civilians remained trapped in cellars, caught between the opposing forces, praying for the battle to end. On the evening of December 23rd, Piper received a final radio message from division headquarters. A relief column would attempt to reach him the following morning. If relief failed to break through by noon on December 24th, he was authorized to destroy his equipment and break out on foot, abandoning everything he could not carry. The relief column never arrived. The American defenses proved too strong. Kampf Group Hansen tried to force a crossing of the Meuse, but was driven back with heavy losses. By noon on December 24th, Christmas Eve, Piper knew that no help was coming. In the early morning hours of December 24th, Piper gathered his remaining men in the basement of his command post. Approximately 800 were still fit enough to walk. Another 127, most of them seriously wounded, would have to be left behind along with a small rear guard to protect them until American forces arrived. The password for the breakout was Merry Christmas. Before leaving, the Germans destroyed everything they could not carry. They dropped grenades into fuel tanks, set timed charges on ammunition vehicles, and disabled the main guns of their immobilized tanks. Piper ordered the charges staggered, timed to detonate over several hours to give the impression of ongoing combat and mask the withdrawal from American observers. The column moved out at 2 in the morning, heading south toward the Meuse River. They had no vehicles, no heavy weapons, no supplies except what each man could carry on his back. Two Belgian farmers from Gleize were forced at gunpoint to serve as guides through the forested hills. The march covered nearly 20 meters of frozen mountainous terrain, through snowdrifts and across icy streams. American patrols were everywhere, searching for exactly this kind of breakout attempt. At one point near the hamlet of Bulge, the column blundered into an American defensive position. Firing broke out in the darkness. Men fell on both sides. Piper himself had to rally his exhausted troops to fight their way clear. The column pressed on through the night and into Christmas Day. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were left behind, their fate unknown. Others fell through ice into freezing streams and had to be pulled out, their wet uniforms freezing solid in the bitter cold. The sound of American artillery continued in the distance, shelling the positions they had abandoned. By dawn on December 25th, Christmas morning, the remnants of Camp Grouper Paper had crossed the German lines near the village of One. Of the 4,800 men who had begun the offensive 9 days earlier, fewer than 800 returned. They brought with them no tanks, no vehicles, no heavy equipment, nothing but their personal weapons and the frozen filthy uniforms on their backs. Behind them in the ruins of Gleize, American soldiers discovered a graveyard of German armor, 7 Tiger, 2 tanks, more than 50 medium tanks and assault guns, 70 half-tracks, and dozens of other vehicles sat abandoned in the village streets. Some had been destroyed by their crews, turrets blown off by internal explosions. Others were intact, simply out of fuel. American soldiers found jerry cans scattered everywhere, all of them empty. Intelligence officers carefully documented each abandoned vehicle, noting the tactical numbers painted on their hulls and the condition of their equipment. The captured Tiger II tanks were particularly prized, offering Allied engineers their first close examination of Germany's most fearsome weapon. The 136 armored vehicles that Piper abandoned at Lag represented a significant portion of Germany's remaining tank strength in the West. They would never be replaced. The Tiger, 2 tanks, each one requiring 300,000 man-hours to produce in Germany's bombed and disrupted factories, were particularly irreplaceable losses. But Group Piper was just one part of the failed German offensive. To the south, another German armored force had come even closer to the Meuse River before meeting the same fate. The 2nd Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored formations in the German army, had bypassed the besieged American garrison at Bastogne and raced westward toward the Meuse crossings at Dant. This division traced its lineage back to the earliest days of German armored warfare and had fought in Poland, France, the Soviet Union, and Normandy. Its soldiers were veterans of 100 battles, and they knew that this offensive represented Germany's last chance to change the course of the war. Unlike Piper's force, which had been stopped by destroyed bridges and stubborn American resistance, the 2nd Panzer Division found relatively open roads and weak opposition. Their tanks rolled through Belgian villages that had no defenders, their crews straining to reach the river before American reinforcements arrived. By December 23rd, their lead elements had reached the woods near the village of Foy-Nram, just 4 kilometers from the Meuse River. Through their binoculars, German tank commanders could see the winter sun reflecting off the water. They could see the bridges at Dinant that were their objective. They were so close they could almost touch victory. And there they stopped. The tanks of KF Grouper Kuchenhausen, the spearhead of the 2nd Panzer Division, had run completely out of fuel. The crews sat in their vehicles, engines silent, watching the Meuse River 4 miles away. Radio messages went back to division headquarters begging for supplies. The response was always the same. Fuel was coming. Hold your position. Victory was within reach. The fuel never came. On the morning of December 24th, Christmas Eve, American aircraft appeared in the skies above the Ardennes. The weather had finally cleared after days of fog and low clouds, and Allied air power, the one factor Hitler had hoped to neutralize with his winter offensive, was now free to operate. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers swept over the German columns like avenging angels, their 850 caliber machine guns and 500 pounds bombs wreaking havoc on anything that moved. B-26 Marauder medium bombers struck German supply depots and rail lines. The already desperate German fuel situation became catastrophic. Supply trucks that had been inching toward the front were destroyed by the dozens. Fuel dumps in the German rear were set ablaze by precision attacks. That same day, the American 2nd Armored Division launched a counterattack against the stranded German spearhead near Foy NRAM. The German tankers, unable to maneuver their fuel-starved vehicles, could only fight from fixed positions. They had no ability to concentrate forces, no ability to flank the attacking Americans, no ability to do anything but sit and take fire. It was a massacre. British tanks of the 29th Armored Brigade joined the attack from another direction. The Germans found themselves surrounded by enemies they could not reach and could not escape. Tank after tank was knocked out by American and British fire. Those crews who survived fled into the frozen forests, abandoning vehicles that were worth more than their weight in gold. By December 26th, the 2nd Panzer Division had been virtually destroyed. Tanks that could not move were destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. Their fuel tanks drained of the last few liters to burn the vehicles beyond salvage. The German offensive in the central sector died 4 miles from the Meuse, killed by empty fuel tanks and Allied counterattack. Across the entire Ardennes front, the German offensive was collapsing. At Bastogne, the besieged American garrison was relieved by elements of General George Patton's Third Army. On December 26th, the 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement, ending the siege that had captured the world's attention. Along the northern shoulder, American divisions that had held against overwhelming odds began pushing the Germans back toward their starting positions. Hitler refused to accept defeat. He ordered the offensive to continue, throwing fresh divisions into the attack. But without fuel, without ammunition, without replacements for the mounting losses, the attacks were doomed before they began. Each German assault consumed resources that could not be replaced. The offensive had become a one-way journey into destruction. The Battle of the Bulge would continue until late January 1945, but its outcome was decided in those critical 48 hours when German panzers ran out of fuel within sight of their objectives. The greatest German offensive in the West since 1940 ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with the quiet desperation of empty fuel tanks and immobilized armor. The German losses in the Ardennes were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Approximately 100,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Between 600 and 800 tanks and assault guns were destroyed. The majority abandoned due to fuel shortages or mechanical breakdowns rather than enemy action. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 1,000 aircraft trying to support the offensive and protect supply lines. More important than the material losses was the strategic impact. The divisions Hitler threw into the Ardennes were Germany's last operational reserves in the West. The fuel consumed in the offensive could never be replaced. Germany's synthetic fuel plants were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. When the Soviets launched their massive Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, Germany had nothing left to stop them. The Americans suffered heavily as well. Approximately 81,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed and 23,000 captured, made the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest single engagement in American military history. Hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles were lost. Entire divisions had to be rebuilt from scratch, but America could replace its losses. Germany could not. After the war, historians and military analysts studied the German failure in the Ardennes obsessively. Hundreds of books have been written about the battle. Every decision, every engagement, every scenario has been examined and debated. Many factors contributed to the defeat. The stubborn American resistance at places like Bastogne and Elsenburn Ridge, the destruction of critical bridges by combat engineers, the clearing weather that unleashed Allied air power, the arrival of reinforcements at just the right moment. But one factor overshadowed all others: fuel. The Germans began the offensive with approximately 5 days' worth of fuel supplies. They needed to capture American depots to sustain their advance. When those captures failed, when the depots were evacuated or burned, when the bridges were blown and the detours consumed precious gasoline, the offensive was doomed regardless of any other factor. The most powerful tanks in the world are worthless when they cannot move. Yoim Paper survived the war but faced justice for his crimes. In 1946, he was tried at Dau for the Malmedy massacre and other atrocities committed by soldiers under his command during the Battle of the Bulge. Asterisk, He was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was never carried out. Controversy over the interrogation methods used to obtain confessions led to a review of the case. Piper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, then reduced further. He was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956 after serving 11 years. Piper lived quietly in Germany for several years, then moved to France, where he settled in the village of Treves in the early 1970s. His presence did not go unnoticed. Former resistance members recognized him. Local newspapers published stories about the SS officer living in their midst. Piper received threats. In July 1976, Piper's house in Treves was firebombed in the early morning hours. The house burned to the ground. Piper's remains were found in the ashes. He was 61 years old. The perpetrators were never identified. The Tiger II tank that Piper abandoned at Gleize still stands in the village today. It sits in front of the December 1944 museum, carefully preserved as a monument to the battle that saved Western Europe from one last German offensive. Tourists photograph it every day. Children climb on its massive hull and peer into its fighting compartment. Few understand how close that tank and its crew came to reaching the Meuse River. Few understand that an empty fuel tank stopped them as surely as any American weapon. The fuel depot near Stavelot that Piper missed by a few hundred yards is long gone. The millions of gallons that might have changed history were consumed by American vehicles in the campaigns that followed, fueling the drive into Germany and the final defeat of the Nazi regime. A monument now marks the site where American and Belgian soldiers burned 124,000 gallons to create a wall of flame that blocked the German advance. The engineers of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions during the Battle of the Bulge, becoming the most decorated combat engineering unit of the entire war. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Paring, later wrote a book about their experiences titled First Across the Rhine. He always maintained that the destruction of the bridges at Tor was the critical moment when Piper's offensive was stopped. Those damned engineers, Piper had called them. They wore that curse as a badge of honor. The veterans of the Battle of the Bulge gathered every year for decades to remember their comrades who did not survive those frozen days of December 1944. They met at reunions across America and Belgium, sharing memories and stories that only they could truly understand. They returned to the battlefields, walking the same roads where they had fought and bled, visiting the graves of friends who never came home. Their numbers dwindled as the years passed, claimed one by time and age. The last survivors are now in their late 90s and beyond, living testaments to that terrible winter. Soon there will be no one left who stood in the Ardennes when the German tanks came, but the lessons of the battle endure. The greatest army in the world is helpless without fuel. The most advanced weapons are useless without supplies. Victory often depends not on courage or firepower but on logistics. The unglamorous business of getting the right resources to the right place at the right time. Modern militaries still teach the Battle of the Bulge as a case study in the decisive importance of supply lines. The German planners had crafted a bold operational design, but they built their entire strategy on capturing enemy supplies, a factor completely outside their control. When those captures failed, no amount of tactical brilliance could compensate. The American defenders at places like Stavelot, Toipon, and Gleize were not trying to win a decisive battle. They were simply trying to buy time. And every hour they bought, every gallon they denied, the Germans brought the offensive closer to collapse. Hitler gambled everything on the Ardennes Offensive. He assembled the last reserves of the German military machine, the final armored divisions that could still fight, the last stores of precious fuel. He pointed them at Antwerp and ordered them to advance at all costs. They advanced until their fuel tanks ran dry. Then they stopped 4 miles from the bridges that might have changed history. They could see the Meuse River through their binoculars. They could not reach it. 4 miles might as well have been 1,000. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories